Welcome to Dive Deeper.
And we're back in our groups this week. Woohoo!
Yeah, we're really happy that restrictions have eased a little and we can all be back in our groups and in our host homes.
Okay, well, let's jump into our warm-up question. What's a funny story of a time you got in trouble as a kid, either at school or at home?
All right. So Shauna, what stood out to you from the readings this week?
I honestly found it a bit difficult to pick just one thing. There's so much happening in this chapter that I found it a bit challenging to even pick something at all.
Okay, yeah, that's fair enough.
However, after some time, I noticed one part that I wanted to share about today. I particularly enjoyed the first part of the chapter, verses 1 to 20.
Okay, yeah, where Jesus is talking about our heart attitude.
Yeah. Just in case some of us haven't read the chapter, I'll give a brief overview. Jesus at the time was speaking to a group of Pharisees and religious teachers.
So they were questioning Jesus regarding hand washing, which was one of the traditions they would have been accustomed to.
However, Jesus instead redirects their questioning and asks them a question of his own.
Right, which showed their own hypocrisy.
Totally. And afterwards, Peter asks Jesus to explain a bit more. Oliver, can you read verses 15 to 20 for us?
Absolutely. Verses 15 to 20 says, "Then Peter said to Jesus, 'Explain to us the parable that says people aren't defiled by what they eat.' 'Don't you understand yet?' Jesus asked. 'Anything you eat passes through the stomach and then goes into the sewer. But the words you speak come from the heart. That's what defiles you. For from the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, all sexual immorality, theft, lying, slander. These are what defile you. Eating with unwashed hands will never defile you.'"
Thanks, Oliver.
No problem.
So Jesus is making it clear here when he is talking with Peter and the disciples that it didn't matter about rituals or traditions that they were used to at the time.
Right. Jesus tells us what happens in our heart is what truly matters.
Exactly, because we can do all the good things in the world when people are watching. For example, I could be serving at a soup kitchen and seem like the nicest person that they'd ever meet. Except if I go home later and run my mouth about those who I helped that day, what does that really say about my heart and who I am?
Yeah, to put it bluntly, that you're fake.
Exactly. It's true, I would be. And Jesus cares about who we are on the inside more than going through the motions of what makes us look good to those around us.
All right, well, why don't we stop here for a discussion break? What do you think people see when they look at you? Do you resemble what Jesus is talking about here in terms of the intentions of our hearts? Or are you putting on a show and going through the motions?
All right, Oliver, what verses stood out to you this week?
Well, I wonder if any of you guys also had this question when you read the middle of the story. Because do you remember, it's the story about the Canaanite woman, and she asks Jesus to set her daughter free from a demon. And at first, it seems like Jesus doesn't want to because she's not Jewish.
Yeah, that story is kind of confusing.
Yeah, so it almost seems like Jesus is racist. Like, when she begs him to help her, he says he came specifically to reveal God to the Jewish people. And he says, "It isn't right to take food from the children and throw it to the dogs."
Harsh, that seems kind of rude of Jesus. That can't be right.
You're right. And actually, you're right that it isn't right. That's not what this story is showing. We know that Jesus isn't racist. We know that his mission and his love is for people from every ethnic group. But God did choose to work first with the Jewish nation in order then to show the whole world what he's like through them.
Okay, so that's kind of what he means when he says, "I was sent only to help God's lost sheep, the people of Israel."
Yeah. And here's a couple little tidbits that help me understand this passage because it is confusing. So I did a little deeper research into it. So first of all, this story comes right after Jesus talking about what makes a person clean and unclean, like the part that you talked about. And the Jewish people, like the Pharisees, would never have associated with a non-Jewish person or a Gentile because they were considered unclean. But Jesus had just said those exterior rituals, that's not what makes a person clean or unclean.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't connected those two stories before, and that's an important tip for reading the Bible. If a story is confusing or doesn't make sense, read the bits before and after it, and sometimes that helps it make sense.
Yeah, totally, and that's so true of this story. So he says, it's not those rituals that really make someone clean or unclean. Then right away, he goes into the region of Tyre and Sidon. That's non-Jewish territory. He was basically walking into a whole city of unclean stuff. And then he meets this woman who's technically unclean because she doesn't do all the Jewish rituals. And he's like, oh, I probably shouldn't heal your daughter because you're technically unclean. Oh, wait, I will. So this story is connected to Jesus' teaching about what makes you clean and unclean. And he's saying it doesn't matter what ethnic group you come from. What matters for this woman is that she has faith in Jesus. Like he says in verse 28, "Dear woman," Jesus said to her, "your faith is great. Your request is granted." And her daughter was instantly healed.
Okay, well that makes more sense.
Yeah, and one more bit about how the story after this relates to this story. Jesus feeds the 4,000. So that sounds kind of familiar, right? Just a couple chapters ago, Jesus had fed the 5,000. Well, that happened in Jewish territory, but the feeding of the 4,000, guess where that happens?
Gentile territory?
Right, so when he says to the woman, it isn't right to take bread from the children and throw it to the dogs, right after that, he literally gives bread to thousands of Gentiles. So the bread represents the blessings of the Messiah coming to people from all nations, not just the Jewish people.
That's really cool. At first, the story seemed kind of racist and offensive, but that's totally not what it is.
Yeah, so I know this is a little bit more information than we usually give in our Dive Deeper videos, but I felt like it was really important for this one because the story is pretty confusing at first glance.
Okay, so let's bring it to an application. How does this story relate to our lives?
Well, I think the main point is that Jesus was opening the possibility of a relationship with God to all people, regardless of their ethnicity. So basically, Jesus isn't racist, so we shouldn't be racist either.
Right, okay, fair enough. But you know, sometimes we're all racist without really even being aware of it. I know for myself, and obviously all of you know that I married a man from India. He grew up in Saudi Arabia. Like some of you don't know that. That's where he was born. So one day we were first starting to talk and date, and he said, my country is known for terrorism. And I was like, my country's known for peacekeeping. But then my response to him was like, well, like don't blow up anything. Like you can explode my heart like with love. And he was like, my little racist. And I was like, oh, that's kind of racist, isn't it? And sometimes I can be unintentionally racist, and he calls me on it, thankfully.
Okay, so let's have a discussion in our groups about racism. And hey, it's Black History Month, so that's kind of fitting. So why don't you talk with your group and ask these questions. How have you ever been unintentionally racist in the past? And how can your Christian faith help you be actively anti-racist?
Awesome. Well, I hope you guys really enjoyed that. Hope you got a lot from your discussions.
Yeah, and now it's your turn. So if you had something from the readings this week that you found interesting, why don't you take out your journals, or maybe a question you had, something that didn't make sense, and you can talk about that now with your group. I'll see you next week.
Bye.